The last few weeks have seen the new NVIDIA Super Series GPUs come through in dribs and drabs, with the RTX 4070 Super and 4070 Ti Super hitting the market. And though they don't offer huge amounts of extra performance in the grand scheme of things, any extra performance at the same price point is always welcomed. Whereas today, it's all a little bit different, with the RTX 4080 Super said to offer up a minute amount of extra performance when compared to the RTX 4080, but for $200 less than its MSRP launch price. So this could be an interesting battle at the top. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor. Hello mate, you alright? Yeah, just got all the bits for my banging new gaming PC. Just got to put it together. It's going to be so much better than yours. Oh, right. What did you get then? The latest Intel 12th gen processor, a feature-packed motherboard, and 32GB of DDR4 memory. See? Miles ahead of yours. You realise that board needs DDR5 memory, don't you? Don't tell me you went and bought the wrong stuff. DDR4 is so 2014. I can't believe you was that stupid. What? No, you're joking. What should I get then? For me, I'd be looking at Corsair's newest Vengeance DDR5 kits, or if you're wanting that all-important RGB, then go for the Dominator Platinum RGB. Oh, you are a lifesaver, thanks, but where can I find out more? By clicking the link in the description below, of course. And you call me the stupid one. Okay, so I don't want to stomp over old ground about the other Super Series GPUs and what they're about, who they're aimed at, and how different or not they actually are compared to their predecessors. Instead, I want to focus purely on the RTX 4080 Super, because while the others were, I guess you could class as mainstream, mid-range GPUs aimed at the 1440 or 1080p high refresh rate market, the 4080 Super is firmly set on high resolution, high refresh, all singing, all dancing types of gaming. Essentially, with the RTX 4090 to one side, which, though it is the fastest gaming GPU on the planet right now, you could argue that it's also a titan in all but a name. So the RTX 4080 Super is set to be, I guess, from NVIDIA, the fastest gaming GPU for the mainstream market. So how do the specs differ from the bog standard 4080? Well, the GPU itself hasn't changed as such. The variant has, but not the GPU. It's still using the AD103 GPU core, but instead of the AD103-300A1 chip, it's now the AD103-400A1. And due to this mild change, I'm not really expecting anything, if at all, from the performance side of things. Though we may see some smoothing out in the lows, but really beyond that, you can expect not much else, with maybe some extra stability from the GPU core, but nothing the average gamer would ever see. Now, there has been an increase in specs, but they aren't anything massive. We're talking 5% more shading units, the same for texture mapping units, streaming multiprocessors, Tensor cores, and RT cores, while the ROPs have stayed the same at 112 and the L2 cache is still at 64 meg. So again, this further instills the fact that performance should be about the same, though some games may be able to harness the extra 5% here or there. And of course, we will also have margin of error and the Silicon Lottery at play as well. Now, along with what I'll call refinements, the clock speeds have seen a small bump with a 4% increase in the base clock, up from 2205 MHz to 2295, and then a smaller 2% increase in boost clock, up from 2505 to 2550 MHz. Along with this, while we do have the same 16GB of GDDR6X memory on a 256-bit bus, the bandwidth has been increased from 716.8GB a second to 736.3, thanks to the increased memory clock speed of 1438 MHz, or 23 gigabits per second effective. So I guess, even though the increases are small, NVIDIA never aimed to set the world alight with huge increases, because that would really annoy a lot of gamers who had already paid $1,200 or so for the OG 4080. This can be seen as more of a refinement. Now, as we've seen from brands including NVIDIA before, it's not anything new. They've had a chance to work with a certain process and have managed to find refinements within that and bring a better product to market. And in the case of the 4080 Super, for a cheaper launch price of $999, which compared to the $1,200 price tag on the original 4080 non-Super, I'm all for, especially as AMD have the upper hand as of late in terms of price cuts to their 7900 series. Though the 4080 has been dropping in price lately here and there, but for the most part, it's pretty close to its original launch price at most retailers. Now we have two 4080 Supers here today, and in usual fashion we've tested the Nvidia card in a large selection of games, while the Inno card we have is more about making sure the performance is at the same level and then seeing how cooling performance is on both cards. Because with the same GPU underneath each cooler, the results would get a bit boring when looking at two identical graphics cards, with the only difference being the cooler and the clock speeds. So starting with the Founders card. Now, one of the best things about the Founders Edition cards has to be their design. And while this does look like some previous generations of Founders Edition, you'll notice that the chrome trim is now gone, very much like the 4070 Super, and instead is replaced by a much more menacing looking all black design. This murdered out look is much more aggressive, but also more stealthy overall. There's a good mixture of matte finished lightly textured surfaces and gloss on the trim to keep it looking interesting. But there's no RGB or any bright paintwork, so it should blend into anything from a gaming PC to a work system and look right at home in either. The RTX 4080 Super looks stunning though, and it features two fans, with a large fan taking up the back of the card on this side. However, on the reverse there's another fan at the other end of the card, so air is pulled through the card in two different directions, with a heatsink featuring angled fins to better direct airflow from the centre of the card out towards the edges. Now, I love the more premium look of the Founders Edition cards, as they have an enclosed look that just hides a lot of the screws and fixtures and fittings, and it just looks more modern and stylish than a lot of the gamer-focused designs that we typically see. Obviously, being an Nvidia card, it features the latest 12-inch PWR connector, love it or hate it. Personally, I like it as it means just a single cable is required with a newer PSU, and it makes cable management so much easier as well. At the back of the card you'll find 4 display outputs, not that this is uncommon these days, but if you're running a multi-display configuration, you're well covered. Then, stripping the card down, you can see it features a really tidy looking PCB with a powerful VRM configuration, as you would expect from this being a more powerful card overall. There's 8 2GB memory ICs surrounding the GPU, giving the card its 16GB GDDR6X total, so no real change from the 4080 non-Super. There's also a cutout in the PCB allowing the rear fan to push air through the heatsink without compromising on airflow, while also keeping the card a little bit shorter overall. So moving on to the Inno3D card. Now, Inno3D make great looking graphics cards, and while I did love their older cards from kind of years ago that looked utterly bonkers with wild colours and lots of crazy fan configurations, I think it's safe to say that they have matured quite a bit, and their new designs are their best yet. Now, the new RTX 4080 Super X3 follows I guess similar logic to the Nvidia Founders Edition, in that they've dropped any bright colours or highlights and gone for more of a toned down aesthetic with a complete lack of RGB. This means that you could put this in an office computer or a high-end gaming rig and it will look right in either of them. The two-tone angled black and brushed metal look is stunning, more like they've got, I don't know, an architect to design it rather than a gamer, but it works very, very well. However, what does strike me is that it is an awfully big graphics card, and with 3 100mm fans on the front of it, that's hardly surprising. What does catch my attention, however, is why it looks so big. It's a slimmer card, coming in at just 2 slots when many RTX 4080 Supers are triple slot cards. Inno3D have effectively pancaked the card flat, making it slimmer but much wider and a bit longer as a result. The slim design does look fantastic from the side profile though, and as you can see there's a 12VH PWR connector tucked into the middle of the card. At the rear there's 4 display connections with 3 DisplayPort and a single HDMI, plus you can see just how much that wider shroud extends beyond the PCI bracket. Again though, a wider card and bigger fans seems like a good trade-off to me. At the back there's a large metal backplate which provides added durability and cooling to the card, but there's also a huge section of ventilation towards the rear too. This vent allows the rearmost fan and part of the middle fan to blow air directly through the GPU, which should offer significant improvements to the cooling efficiency. Now with the shroud removed, you can see there are a significant number of capacitors on the PCB, more than I saw on the Founders Edition, and a range of good quality black chokes too. There are 8 2GB memory ICs, giving the card a total of its 16GB GDDR6X VRAM, and then the back of the PCB is looking very clean, with some very robust looking solder points. I mean, everything just looks heavily built, which is always a good sign. Now the heatsink itself is, well, massive, and while it may be slimmer, it more than makes up for it with surface area, and 7 heat pipes run through both sides of the heatsink and then all pass right over the GPU and power delivery hardware, which has a massive contact plate to ensure both the GPU and the VRAM are directly cooled. So a real step up in terms of design, though some very big cards in the first place. So obviously make sure dimensions aren't an issue if you're looking to pick one up for your own system. Now as mentioned, when we have multiple cards sporting the same GPU, it makes no sense to test both of them fully. So while we'll be looking at the cooling potential of both of them, let's jump into the suite of games on the Founders card. Now to test, we put the card onto our GPU test bench with an AMD Ryzen 7 7800X3D on a Gigabyte B650E Aorus Master with 32GB of Corsair Vengeance RGB, 6000MHz CL30 dual channel memory. All of our testing was done on Windows 11 with the latest updates applied and with the latest BIOS revision for the motherboard. The driver used was NVIDIA's 551.22 driver, and we tested 16 games in total. Now, due to the positioning of the 4080 Super and the fact that at that level of performance, bottlenecks rear their ugly head, we'll be looking at 1440p and 4K today before taking a look at overall averages. And we'll be testing more games in the near future, so if you want to see all the data for that, as well as 1080p, then you can over on our Patreon. The link for that is down below. Also, as this is more of a, not beat around the bush, a refresh of the RTX 4080, our focus will be in seeing what levels of performance we get in comparison to that and what that does for our standings. So with that out of the way, let's get into those glorious benchmarks. So starting with a Plague Tale Requiem, and at 1440p on the Ultra preset, we're looking at 1% more performance from the 4080 to the 4080 Super, equating to just a single FPS, which I guess can be deemed as margin of error in both the averages and the 1% lows. Now it's the same story at 4K too, now hitting 60 FPS with identical 1% lows. So AMD still win with the 7900 XTX, which offers up more performance but for a cheaper price at 1440p, and even beats the RTX 4090 at 4K. In Baldur's Gate 3, we see quite a large uplift at 1440p of 7% in the averages and a much healthier 18% in the 1% lows, likely due to the increased memory throughput along with slightly higher specs, and this helps to widen the gap with AMD, now by 8%. Then at 4K, the uplift is much smaller at just 3%, but this now means, even though it can be classed as margin of error, that Nvidia push ahead of AMD, who were matching performance but still see Team Red excelling in the 1% lows. In Call of Duty, the increase is just ahead of what we'd call margin of error with a 5% uplift at 1440p, though again AMD still managed to push ahead by 10% with the 7900 XT and 15% ahead with the 7900 XTX. So from a value for money perspective, it's not looking as good as it could for Nvidia. And then it's a similar story at 4K, where we do see a 7% uplift in frame rates, but the 7900 XT still sits 3% ahead of that, and a whopping 21% ahead when compared to the 7900 XTX, with only the RTX 4090 coming in above, but, as we know, for a much higher price point. A small 2% gain comes by way of Cyberpunk at 1440p, with no real change to the 1% lows, other than a single FPS difference. Again, it's nice to see some extra performance, but AMD with both the 7900 XT and XTX still managed to come out on top by a very small margin, and with strong low figures as well, with the XTX actually pushing past the mammoth RTX 4090, so there's definitely some points of contention there. Then at 4K, performance is identical when comparing the 4080 and 4080 Super, and with AMD now dropping down the chart slightly, Nvidia definitely have an argument for having the better card. But at such small margins, cost per frame is going to be an interesting point a little bit later on. Now in our first ray tracing test, again we're talking a single 1 FPS uplift from the 4080, and retesting could actually see this change due to margin of error. Though as expected, this does now put the 4080 Super 53% ahead of the 7900 XTX, so ray tracing could be the saving grace between the battle of the high-end GPUs. 4K again sees a single FPS difference and with identical 1% low figures, so nothing of huge contention here, though a healthy lead of 53% over AMD's 7900 XTX is definitely a strong position to be in, and great news for the 4080 Super. F123 already had the 4080 pushing out high frame rates of 356 FPS, and moving up to the 4080 Super sees that increase by 3%. Though as the game does have a strong AMD BIOS, it's not enough to fend off both the 7900 XT and XTX, which both come in with higher performance overall. 4K is the same with a 3% increase in performance, while the 7900 XT comes in 7% faster overall, and the XTX 28% faster, though at such high levels of performance, it's nothing the average gamer would ever notice. As we enable ray tracing, things get shaken up a little bit as expected. At 1440p, the 4080 Super sees a small 3% increase in performance over the non-Super, which further extends its lead over the 7900 XTX by 9%, and with much stronger 1% low figures, which also sees an uplift. Now at 4K, we're talking much smaller gains of just a single FPS, though this just further increases the lead that Nvidia had over AMD, now with the 4080 Super positioned 12% faster in this game. Far Cry 6 is another game that sees increases in performance, but not by anything substantial, where we're only talking 4%. But the 1% lows do see a larger gain of 9%, in a bid to smooth things out a little. While the performance is now closer to AMD, both the 7900 XT and XTX still hold the lead by 1 and 11% respectively. As we move up to 4K, the performance difference between the 4080 and the Super is negligible at just 1 FPS, but the increase of 10 FPS in the lows is very much welcomed. Though AMD still managed to push ahead with the 7900 XT pumping out 3% more performance, and the XTX coming in an impressive 19% ahead. When we enable ray tracing, the RTX 4080 was sitting just behind the 7900 XTX, whereas now the Super, thanks to an increase of 4% in the averages, nips just past AMD in both the averages and the 1% lows, which have now seen a sizable 12% uplift as well. At 4K, AMD managed to claw it back, even with a 2% increase in performance going from the 4080 to the Super, but at such close performance between them all, it's nothing you'd likely ever notice. But a win is still a win, and on this occasion, it's to the cheaper AMD card. Hogwarts Legacy sees no real change with the new 4080 Super as it comes in with a margin of error FPS loss. Though again, as expected, the slightly healthier specs do manage to smooth out the dips with a 12% increase in the lows. This keeps the 4080 Super close to the performance of the 7900 XT in the averages, but is no match for the 7900 XTX, which still pulls ahead of the RTX 4090. Then at 4K it's a very similar story, small but unnoticeable differences that just keep the lead over the 7900 XT, but the XTX is a hard one to ignore, which positions itself ahead of the 4080 Super and only just behind the RTX 4090. Ray tracing again helps fight the case for the 4080 Super with a 13% uplift in performance from the non-Super, which just further extends the lead over everything AMD have to offer, which puts the 7900 XTX 22% behind and in the territory of being unplayable. Now it's the same at 4K, a 15% increase in performance which further widens the gap with AMD, though at the figures we're seeing, upscaling really is the only saving grace for any of these cards, including the RTX 4090. Moving over to Spider-Man at 1440p on the very high preset, and again there is an increase in performance between the two 4080 cards, but at just 1 FPS it doesn't equate to much, other than just further improving on the lead it held over AMD, now pushing 6% more performance. Then at 4K, the 4080 was evenly matched with the 7900 XTX, but now, thanks to a 3% uplift, it puts Nvidia 4% ahead of AMD's best offering. Switching ray tracing on, and even at 1440p, there's some pretty severe bottlenecks, even with a 7800X3D, which actually sees the 4080 Super coming 2 FPS lower than the standard 4080. Though Silicon Lottery could be at play here too, but it's still enough to give a 5% lead over the 7900 XTX, so still a win for Team Green. Then at 4K, we see a 2% improvement over the RTX 4080, meaning that the 4080 Super now sports an 8% lead over the 7900 XTX as it starts to claw things back just a bit. Ratchet & Clank at 1440p saw AMD's 7900 XTX ahead of the 4080 by 8%, though with a 5% increase on the 4080 Super, AMD do still sit ahead, but by a smaller margin of just 3%. Now what is clear from this game is that AMD really do a lot better in the lows, which, even with a small uplift from the 4080, is not enough to compete with AMD, and is definitely something that the game developer needs to fix, as we find on every Nvidia GPU, it suffers. 4K now has the 4080 Super ahead of AMD by a single FPS and 1% low figures that line up a little better thanks to the 6% improvement over the RTX 4080, though the 1% lows are still on the low side for anything from Team Green, but again is more of a fault of the game if anything. Enabling ray tracing at 1440p doesn't really garner anything beyond a single FPS improvement, which can be put down to margin of error. But with an already healthy lead over AMD, this just increases the margin to a 40% lead in favour of the 4080 Super, when comparing to the flagship 7900 XTX from AMD. And it's the same story at 4K, where a single FPS improvement is seen between the 4080 and 4080 Super, but this means that Nvidia now hold a 46% lead over AMD's 7900 XTX, which shows Nvidia really are the frontrunner in terms of ray tracing performance. Lastly, in Starfield, the 4080 Super manages to lose 1 FPS when compared to the 4080, so margin of error differences, but still sits just ahead of AMD's 7900 XTX, with 11% more performance in the lows. It will definitely lend itself to a more fluid gameplay experience overall, and is always something that we like to see. Then lastly, at 4K, thanks to a 5% increase in performance which puts the 4080 Super at 80 FPS, it's enough to fend off the 7900 XTX, which was above the 4080, albeit by a small 3% margin. But as always, while I'm tempted to quote The Fast and Furious, I won't, and I'll just say a win is a win. So as expected, there were some gains when directly comparing the 4080 to the 4080 Super. The small increase in specs and clock speeds have their place, but in some games there just wasn't the utilisation that could equal more performance overall. But I get it. Nvidia have refined their manufacturing process, and while they are at the limits of the silicon, they've managed to push things to their limits and offer it up as a now cheaper alternative. And I don't really feel that there's any room for complaint in terms of that. The same or better performance, within margin of error, for a cheaper price. I guess the only real room for improvement is for those consumers who have only just purchased an RTX 4080 at a higher than $1,000 price tag. Because, well, you're going to feel slightly jilted. But that's just how things work in the real world, and keeping your ear to the ground on new launches, well, really, that is the only thing that can potentially stop that from happening. You can't really blame Nvidia for that one. Now, something we've been wanting to add into our day one reviews is upscaling performance, because it's very clear to see that even with a 4080 Super, some of the games at higher resolutions with the settings completely cranked to the max, along with obviously ray tracing, were at levels that I guess could be better, and DLSS will more than make up for that. It's here in Cyberpunk where the RTX 4080 Super pretty much, or at least within margin of error, matches the same upscaling performance of the RTX 4080 non-Super. Now, while the 4080 Super gave us more performance with no upscaling, the 4080 non-Super did manage to edge ahead in both DLSS and DLSS 3 tests, again due to silicon lottery and margin of error. What we are seeing though is a 9% improvement when enabling DLSS into balanced mode, but the bigger number being 96% when we go from no upscaling to DLSS 3, now at 214 frames per second. When looking at cranking things up to the Ray Tracing Ultra preset, it's a similar story. The 4080 Super is ahead in practically all tests in comparison to the 4080 non-Super, but again, by very small margins. The more important talking point is how we're seeing a 183% boost in performance when enabling DLSS 3 with frame generation, taking us from 58 FPS to a whopping 164 frames per second, while simultaneously looking amazing in terms of image quality. Moving over to Hogwarts, and again we see big jumps in performance from our pure rasterization test to then enabling upscaling. Switching DLSS onto balance mode nets us 51% extra performance, while DLSS 3 with frame generation scores another 40% more performance on top of that, equaling a total of 112% extra performance over the run we did from no form of upscaling to DLSS 3 with frame generation. Then lastly, when we turn ray tracing on, while the performance is still within playable realms, the 1% low figures were dropping to around 45 FPS. And while DLSS did manage to boost the average FPS slightly, it didn't really do much for the 1% lows. Luckily, frame generation comes to the rescue again, giving us 128% more performance over the non-DLSS test, and increasing the 1% lows by almost 100%. So some pretty strong performance overall, with thanks to frame generation. It really does come across as a kind of voodoo or witchcraft. And it is something that we're looking to do a bigger feature on in the near future, where we compare image quality across various upscaling technologies. So let us know down below if that's something you want to see in the very near future. Obviously, there is a lot more to it than just performance boost, especially if it means the image quality itself has to suffer. Now, performance to one side, how do things line up from a money perspective? Because I guess really, according to Nvidia and the way that I see this, that's where this card is kind of seemingly aimed, and that's what it's all about. A lot of the same, but for a cheaper price. So in theory, we should see better bang for buck compared to the predecessor. That's a given, but how does that now line up with what the competition have? Well, it's here where the price cut makes quite a stark difference. At 1440p, we were originally seeing a cost of $8.30 per frame on the RTX 4080, based on the overall average of 144 FPS, while the 4080 Super now comes in a pretty healthy 19% cheaper per frame. While this is nice to see, it still actually puts it as more costly than both the 7900 XT and 7900 XTX from AMD, even though performance sits just between them when looking at the average FPS. At 4K, it's a similar story. The original RTX 4080 was coming in at $18.52 per frame, while the new and cheaper 4080 Super comes in at $14.56 per frame, so around 21%. Though again, it is more expensive when compared to both top-end offerings from AMD, which have seen some price cuts lately. Maybe that was in anticipation for this launch and knowing what Nvidia were going to come out with. So some better numbers overall in terms of the cost, and a lot of our followers have even commented lately that they don't mind a little more, spending a little more to get an Nvidia card over AMD because of the feature set. Obviously talking about DLSS 3 with frame generation, overall image quality and drivers, though I guess on that last one it could be argued either way. Now moving on from frame rates and costing, as always we have multiple cards with us, and the big thing separating them is power, temperatures and fan speeds. It's here where we threw both the Founders Edition and X3 cards both onto F123 for a 1 hour loop to see exactly how they perform for a prolonged gaming session. So starting with the Nvidia FE card, and for the most part, our GPU temperatures were pretty tame, with a GPU core sitting around 62 degrees and a hotspot a little higher towards 73 degrees, all while the memory junction temperature also remained under control at 68 degrees. The card itself managed to boost to 2805 MHz, all while using around 272 watts of total board power. During the run, as expected, the fans didn't really do much, hovering around 1300 RPM, so very quiet in the grand scheme of things. The Inno card ran a little warmer, likely due to its slimmer design, where the GPU temperature rose to just short of 70 degrees, with a hotspot of 80 degrees and with a memory junction temperature that was also a little higher at 70 degrees. The card also didn't boost as far as the FE, at only around 2665 MHz, and with lower GPU usage, almost like the card wasn't being pushed to its fullest in this game, though the fans were certainly more noticeable at 1800 RPM, but still in the realm of being fairly quiet overall. Due to the 3 large fans, the total board power did increase beyond the FE and saw the X3 sitting around 300 watts during our 1 hour run. So what do we think? I think it's clear to see that the 4080 Super is a step up in everything but performance. Sure, some games can utilise the extra specs that the 4080 Super has, but at such a small amount, it's still within margin of error, and the Silicon Lottery comes into play too. And that was evident when we actually saw the 4080 non-Super beating it by a few frames per second here and there in certain games. So you could argue, why didn't Nvidia just price cut the 4080? And while they've not confirmed anything with us, we do have our theories. When Nvidia placed an order for the silicon from their partners, they are paying for, they're paying a specific price based on the fabrication process, and the 4080 non-Super never saw that change, whereas the 4080 Super is slightly different, as per the GPU variant naming structure. So Nvidia have found a way to refine the process, and in turn, it's likely costing them less money. Their costs go down, and therefore they can afford to pass those savings on. Whereas simply cutting the price of an existing product that's been made under a more expensive fab process and has already been paid for is a completely different kettle of fish. So I'm all for this. And like I said earlier, it does seem that gamers are happy to pay more for an Nvidia card, as seen by how much of the market Nvidia have and the fact that AMD have even been rumoured to say that they may stop making high-end GPUs, much like we saw with the 5000 series, which topped out as the 5700 series. They I guess simply can't compete. That's not to say in terms of rasterization, high frame rate numbers, but more in terms of features and of course ray tracing. So that all puts, I guess, Nvidia in a really good position and allows them, yes, to charge more money, but also do these mid-cycle changes where money and savings can actually be passed on. So I don't know, maybe they're not as bad as we all think. Sure, we'd all like to see it even cheaper, but the 4080 Super is still likely to outsell both the 7900 XT and 7900 XTX by a huge margin, much like the more expensive 4080 non-Super already has. So definitely some kind of food for thought. I always had my feelings about how the 4080 was too expensive, but at $1,000, it's definitely a card that really has no competition when you factor in all elements, including performance, ray tracing, upscaling, streaming, and all the other features that separate AMD and Nvidia. And there you go, that's going to wrap this one up. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, then a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do and want to help support the channel, you can over on our Patreon, where you'll get access to a ton of cool exclusive benefits, including behind the scenes content, access to all of our charts, live streams, and much more. The link for all that great stuff is, as always, down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.